I would go so far as to say that it's really at the base of a lot of the massive crises, conflict zones that we face right now. There is a stretch of drylands across the Sahel of Africa, which is the region just south of the Sahara, through the Horn of Africa, up through the Middle East, and into Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that is, in my opinion, not coincidentally, both the drylands belt and the conflict belt. And our conflict zone is treated by our strategists, our military and so forth, mainly as an issue of Islam and Islamism and other things. I think this is a big mistake. What I see on the ground in these places where I visit frequently is hungry people, a lack of livelihoods, a bulging population because fertility rates are very high, die-offs of livestock, and failing rains. And people are hungry, they're desperate, their children aren't in school, the communities are impoverished, traditional ways of doing things don't work anymore. There's a politically correct, frequent statement that we ought to let communities use their traditional means and not impose outside methods and so forth. We're way past that in reality right now because traditional means were based on populations that are 1/10 of what they are now. More plentiful rainfall, more favorable environmental areas. These places cannot exist on traditional means anymore, on indigenous knowledge. Not that it's all useless, I don't mean that, but the idea that there's some easy, natural way if they would just be left alone is also absolutely not correct. Now I have to add that bombing them also doesn't solve any of these problems. And so I think our military strategies have been failures and will continue to be failures, and I think we're spreading the range of failure right now. We're not solving it, unfortunately. We're going to move into Pakistan with a wider failure, it seems to me. So I think that the problems are climate, population, water, and so on. Other aspects of our institute and their partnerships suggest multiple other damages that are already taking place. Of course, the storm events. Kerry Emanuel's theory, Kerry Emanuel at MIT and his theory of increasing severity of the energy delivery of hurricanes, which has perhaps been temporarily masked by conditions in the Atlantic right now, because there's a 12-year Atlantic cycle which probably offsets a little bit of the warming of the Caribbean, but is likely to cause much more frequent, more frequent Category 5 hurricanes than in the past. Not necessarily more frequent hurricanes, but more frequent damage. A lot of disease transmission is climate related, and we have a unit looking at climate and health, which is finding pretty alarming signals. And of course, the ecologists are finding that every ecosystem that they look at is being impacted already by the very pervasive patterns of climate change. Of course, not only the warming, as I'm stressing, but also water evapotranspiration, precipitation patterns, and so on. I come into this at the next stage of this chain of risk, which is at the political side. What do you do about it? I think we took a very good step. We got a president in place who's interested in this and very knowledgeable, and he did something very, very important, which is to bring into position by far the strongest scientific team that has ever been in Washington. So we have an extremely strong and committed scientific leadership right now. It doesn't mean we're going to solve this problem, by the way, though. And we're in the midst of a very difficult process politically in the US, and even more difficult process politically worldwide. Worldwide is probably a good place for me to start. We need agreements around the globe to address this issue. China has overtaken the US as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. That gap is very likely to widen substantially in the future. China grows a lot faster than the US economy. China is a natural coal-burning economy, and their greenhouse gases are going to continue to soar in the future. They haven't overtaken the US in per capita, obviously. We still are champions of per capita emissions of roughly 20 tons per person per year of carbon dioxide and about 24 tons per person per year of all greenhouse gases. And China is about 1/4 of that right now. But nature doesn't care about per capita, nature cares about the total. And China's now by far, or not by far, it's now edged out the US as having the biggest greenhouse contributions per year, and that gap will widen. The developing countries are more than half of the emissions in total now, adding in China, India, Brazil, other developing countries, and that gap will also widen because the developing countries are growing faster than the developed countries, and that is a process that is good and natural. It means that they're catching up technologically, catching up in living standards. That's what we want, I believe, but it's not so good from the point of view of greenhouse accounting, and makes it not so easy from the point of view of global negotiations. We're in the middle of the second year of what's supposed to be a 2-year process to reach a global agreement that will follow on the Kyoto Protocol, which we never signed, of course, but which others did sign and put into effect, and which ends in 2012. And the timetable internationally has been to reach an agreement that, without a break, would extend past 2012. There's something called the Bali Action Plan, which is the 2-year negotiating framework. It's supposed to talk about 4 main things: mitigation of greenhouse gases, adaptation to climate change, transfer of technology worldwide to facilitate mitigation and adaptation, and financing from the rich countries to the poor countries to enable them to be part of this process. As you might guess, we haven't solved any 4 of those problems. We are inching around a kind of agreement on the first one, which would say that essentially what the Obama administration is hoping for is that Europe would reduce its emissions by 20% relative to a 1990 baseline as of 2020. The US would reduce by about 15% relative to 2005. In other words, much less than Europe has, but that's what they're going to try to negotiate. That the developing countries would commit to not an absolute reduction of emissions, but to a deviation of their time path of emissions relative to a business as usual path. So we would say, yes, China's growing very fast, its emissions will grow, but they'll grow 20% less as of 2020 compared to what they would be without the actions that China's going to undertake. So to measure the developing country commitment as a deviation from the total. We probably can reach some kind of soft agreement around that when you look at it, the optimists will say, well, that's a step forward. The pessimists will say, that's a cop-out, and that won't be any kind of dramatic breakthrough, but will be a conceptual breakthrough. That seems to me to be feasible. A big announcement that says we've all taken on the following goals. Meeting those goals is a completely different thing, by the way. But just taking on some soft goals seems likely.